1,000 years. That's the length of time commonly tucked away under the rather dramatic label of the Dark Ages. From the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 to the beginning of the Renaissance, somewhere around the 14th century, Europe seemed to slip into a mysterious fog of silence. No great inventions, few towering figures, even fewer preserved records. And for a long time, the consensus was simple: people must have just stopped doing interesting things. But here's the catch. History, like your dreams, often makes more sense when you look at what isn't there. The Dark Ages weren't actually dark. They were dimmed. Records weren't completely lost. Many were never written down in the first place. Innovations weren't absent. They just weren't publicized by chroniclers obsessed with church affairs. And as we start dusting off old bones, decoding scribbled parchments, and poking around in peat bogs, we're learning that this age wasn't quite so empty after all. In fact, one of the greatest mysteries of the era is just how much was lost or deliberately hidden. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, it wasn't like a curtain dropped overnight. Roman senators didn't just toss their togas in the fire and become goat herders. But slowly, silently, something changed. Cities shrank, trade routes twisted or vanished, infrastructure rotted, and most surprisingly of all, for nearly a millennium, Europe's collective memory dimmed. The clearest evidence: a shocking lack of continuity. Roman engineers built roads that lasted 1,000 years, but within a few generations, many of those same roads were impassable, and nobody seemed to know how to fix them. Entire cities, once bursting with life, were abandoned. Grand libraries were reduced to rubble or repurposed as goat sheds. And much of the written record vanished poof, leaving behind a frustratingly sparse paper trail. It's not just about what's missing. It's about the bizarre consistency of the absence. In modern archaeological layers, we expect to find gradual changes. But in many European digs from the 6th to 9th centuries, there's a strange flatness: fewer coins, fewer artifacts, and eerily uniform pottery. It's as if culture went to sleep and kept hitting snooze for 400 years. But was this vanishing act really as bleak as it looks? Some historians now argue that the term Dark Ages says more about the people who coined it than the people who lived through it. Renaissance thinkers like Petrarch had an image to protect, one where they heroically rediscovered the wisdom of the ancients after a long, embarrassing dry spell. And what better way to feel like a genius than to declare everyone before you was stumbling around in the dark? Still, questions remain. Why did so many cities collapse while Constantinople thrived? Why did monasteries become the last strongholds of writing and reading? Why does it feel like someone pulled a curtain across the stage just before the second act? And more tantalizingly, did anyone intend for the curtain to stay closed? Some fringe theories go full conspiracy mode, suggesting that powerful medieval institutions deliberately suppressed records, rewriting, or erasing history that didn't fit their preferred narratives. Charters were forged, genealogies were corrected, saints were invented wholesale. Is it possible that the early medieval timeline itself was bent or reshaped? Whether you buy into the theory or not, it's hard to argue with this. The historical record from 500 to 1000 AD is patchy at best. Entire royal lineages appear and disappear with minimal documentation. Battles are known only from a single monk's scribble, in a dusty margin. And some kings may have existed only on paper, propped up by church councils looking for a political pawn. All of this leads to a haunting question. Was the darkness of the Dark Ages a natural consequence of chaos, or a carefully crafted shadow? And yet, despite the gaps and erasures, the people of the so-called Dark Ages did leave echoes. Sometimes they survive in oral tales passed down through shepherd families, sometimes in artifacts that emerge from peat bogs remarkably preserved, and sometimes in the records that someone forgot to burn. So while it may look like Europe fell asleep for 1,000 years, the truth is murkier, stranger, and possibly more intentional than anyone wants to admit. If you ever want to feel profoundly puzzled, try asking a historian why Roman concrete disappeared for over 1,000 years. Not the idea of concrete, no. The Romans didn't invent that. But their particular blend, the stuff that kept aqueducts standing through earthquakes and ocean spray, was astonishing. So naturally, you'd expect those techniques to be passed along, studied, maybe even improved. Instead, poof, forgotten. As if someone tossed the recipe into the Tiber and watched it float away. This wasn't just an engineering oversight. It was a civilization-wide case of technological amnesia. Roman roads lasted centuries. Their aqueducts delivered water across miles of uneven terrain. They built domes and arches that still baffle architects. Yet within a few generations, after the empire's western fall, these marvels became mysterious ruins, and no one could quite recall how they worked. Take the baths of Caracalla in Rome. At their peak, they housed gyms, libraries, gardens, and Olympic-sized pools heated no less. 2 centuries later, people were living in wooden huts next to the crumbling pillars, completely unaware of how to reconstruct even the plumbing. Some even believed the ruins were built by giants or ancient gods, which, okay, fair guess, if your entire world now consisted of wooden carts and hand-dug wells, the strange part isn't just the loss, it's the lack of curiosity. You'd think someone would have tried to reverse engineer it all, but there's remarkably little evidence of experimentation. The knowledge wasn't suppressed. It simply slipped away like sand through a broken hourglass. And where records did survive, they were often in languages few could read, Latin, Greek, or worse, in technical jargon penned by engineers long gone. It's tempting to blame the barbarian invasions. The Visigoths and Vandals certainly did their part to trash infrastructure. But they didn't systematically destroy every engineering manual in Europe. The truth seems more mundane and more tragic. As political power fragmented, cities shrank and priorities shifted, engineering wasn't sexy anymore. What mattered was land loyalty and faith. If an aqueduct broke, you didn't fix it. You dug a ditch and prayed it didn't flood. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines, many of these techniques did persist. They continued using mortar mosaics and even domes. But communication between East and West was patchy, and Latin-speaking Europe was in no mood to take lessons from Greek-speaking Constantinople. So the tech faded, not because it stopped working, but because no one wanted to ask the neighbors how it worked. There's another wrinkle. Some modern researchers believe Roman concrete wasn't lost completely. It just became mythologized. Medieval builders didn't think they could make it, so they didn't even try. And even today, we're only beginning to understand how Roman engineers used volcanic ash and seawater to create self-healing, chemically reactive structures. It's not so much that we couldn't make it, it's that we forgot it was ever possible. And that's the real heart of this mystery, how an entire continent unlearned basic tools and concepts, not because of a single catastrophic event, but because of a slow erosion of confidence, education, and literacy. By the 9th century, even kings could barely sign their own names. Nobles counted wealth in cows, not coins. A world that once built the pantheon now measured ambition in wooden walls and pointy sticks. Of course, not all was gloom and regression. As we'll see in later sections, there were bursts of brilliance tucked into the monasteries and courtly enclaves. But when it came to Roman-level infrastructure, Europe had for a time misplaced the instruction manual, and nobody thought to look under the ruins. If you ever visit a medieval manuscript collection, and you should assuming you enjoy dim lighting, crumbling parchment, and the scent of ancient mildew, you might notice something curious. Beyond the saints and prayers and endless thous and these, there are flourishes, tiny drawings in the margins, squiggles that look decorative until they start looking intentional. Because tucked within some of these illuminated manuscripts is a mystery that's only recently come to light. Were medieval monks hiding information in plain sight? Let's back up. During the early Middle Ages, when most people couldn't read, and the printing press was just a glimmer in the far future, the responsibility of preserving knowledge fell squarely on the shoulders of monks. Tucked away in monasteries, they spent their lives copying texts by hand. This was painstaking, eye-straining work. And sure, some copied Bibles or sermons, but others transcribed older texts, Greek philosophy, Roman law, even early medical knowledge that would have gotten a layperson branded a heretic. So what do you do when you're trying to preserve something that your religious superiors might not approve of? You do what every clever student does during a closed book exam. You hide it in the margins. Historians now believe some medieval manuscripts contain intentional obfuscation codes, symbols, or allegories that allowed monks to preserve forbidden knowledge without getting sent to the monastery's equivalent of detention, which probably involved breadwater and ominous chanting. For example, a manuscript might show a saint with 7 birds on his staff. Seems harmless, until you realize the accompanying text describes a medicinal practice involving 7 herbs. Coincidence? Maybe. But then another manuscript shows a bishop with a serpent coiled around his ankle, and the passage discusses purification rituals. Serpent chonk medicine. We're not saying it's a code, but we're also not saying that. There are even instances of alchemical symbols slipped into the borders, tiny suns, moons, triangles, and chalices, which seem wildly out of place next to the usual lambs and angels. Were these monks moonlighting as amateur chemists? Were they preserving pagan knowledge under layers of piety? Or were they just very bored and trying to make copying a little more exciting? And then there's the Voynich manuscript. No, it's not definitively medieval. And yes, it's the poster child of what even is this thing. But its existence proves a point. Throughout history, some people have written in ways not meant to be read, least not by everyone. And monks with their ink-stained fingers and endless hours had both the means and the motive to do the same. We also have to talk about palimpsests, parchments, where original texts were scraped off and new ones written over. Seems thrifty, until modern tech like multispectral imaging revealed that some of those erased texts were classical works previously thought lost forever. The top layer might be a sermon, the ghostly text underneath Archimedes doing geometry. Surprise, it paints a picture of monks who weren't just mindless scribes, but gatekeepers of a deeper intellectual tradition. They may have taken vows of obedience, but some clearly walked a quiet line between preservation and provocation. Were they revolutionaries? Probably not. But they were careful, clever, and committed to the idea that some knowledge deserved to survive, even if it had to wear a robe and sandals to do so. So the next time you see a medieval Bible with an oddly shaped fish or a haloed rabbit carrying a scroll, take a second look. You might be staring at a 200-year-old game of historical hide and seek. And somewhere, a long-dead monk is smiling into his inkwell, knowing his secret lived on. Charlemagne. Even the name sounds like something pulled from a fantasy novel. Part king, part myth, all very convenient. But here's the thing, despite being hailed as the father of Europe crowned Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day in the year 800 and celebrated for uniting a fractured continent, Charlemagne's sudden rise feels off, too clean, too perfect. As if someone later went back and made sure the puzzle pieces all fit a little too neatly. Let's start with the basics. Charles was born around 742, though even that date is debated. He was the son of Pepin the Short, which already sounds like a comedy sketch, and grandson of Charles Martel, the Frankish hammer, who smacked invading forces at the Battle of Tours. So Charlemagne didn't exactly come from obscurity. But what's strange is how little we know about his early years. He seems to burst onto the scene with full armor and a ready-made narrative. Then in 800, Pope Leo III crowns him Holy Roman Emperor. It's pitched as a spontaneous act the Pope supposedly surprised Charles during a Christmas Mass in Rome. But think about that. You don't just accidentally crown someone. That's not how coronations or popes work. More likely, it was a well-rehearsed performance designed to revive the prestige of the Roman Empire while giving the Church a powerful, loyal protector. Now here's where things get truly mysterious. The empire Charlemagne was supposedly reviving had been dead in the West for over 3 centuries. So why now? Why him? And why was so much of his legacy preserved so precisely? Especially considering that just a few decades earlier, Europe could barely manage to record who was king of what cow-filled valley. Some scholars suspect that Charlemagne's story was retrofitted, carefully documented, after the fact to create a neat, tidy myth of Christian kingship. His biography, Vita Caroli Magni, was written by Einhard, a man who admired Charles deeply, perhaps too deeply. The book is full of glowing descriptions, moral lessons, and conveniently heroic anecdotes. It reads less like a history and more like a holy resume. Even stranger, the Carolingian Renaissance. This so-called burst of intellectual revival during Charles's reign has very uneven archaeological evidence. Yes, manuscripts were copied and schools were encouraged, but in many regions of Europe, daily life remained as muddy and miserable as ever. So how much of this Renaissance was real and how much was a political branding campaign. And let's not forget the timing. The 9th century was a period when the church was consolidating power and needed a champion. What better way to justify its influence than by pointing to a divinely chosen emperor who had been literally crowned by God's representative on earth? Charlemagne's reign served as a foundation myth, a sacred origin story for the Holy Roman Empire. Some conspiracy-minded folks even go further, suggesting the timeline itself was doctored, that events were added or altered to make Charlemagne's empire appear older and more legitimate. This theory, called the phantom time hypothesis, claims that centuries were fabricated by medieval scribes to align biblical prophecy with current events. Most historians roll their eyes at this, but it reflects the lingering discomfort around just how conveniently constructed Charlemagne's legacy feels. And then there are the gaps. After Charles's death in 814, the empire splinters rapidly. His sons and grandsons squabble, borders shift, and soon the whole thing collapses into a patchwork of feuding lords and foreign raids. If this was the glorious rebirth of Rome, it didn't last long. And yet, we continue to treat Charlemagne like a pillar of European identity. Maybe he was a great leader. Maybe he was a symbol. Maybe he was both. But when the historical record feels too tidy, too symmetrical, you have to wonder, were we reading a biography or a script? Either way, one thing's clear. The rise of Charlemagne wasn't just a political event. It was a narrative power play, written in ink and gospel, reinforced by the church and passed down as unquestioned truth. A man became an empire, and an empire became a memory, polished just enough to gleam in the candlelight of history. Now we move from kings to popes, or at least supposed popes, because tucked into the annals of church history, among the saints, sinners, and sandal-wearing scribes, there's a stretch of time that feels suspiciously foggy. Entire decades where the papal record turns murky. Successions that don't quite make sense. Names that flicker in and out of existence. And most intriguingly, a handful of popes who may have never existed at all. Let's talk about the papal dark century, roughly from 900 to 1049. Historians have actually dubbed this period the Saeculum Obscurum, or the Dark Age of the Papacy. And for good reason. It was a time when the Vatican was less Holy Empire and more family business run by aristocratic Roman clans, complete with assassinations, bribes, and the occasional pope who mysteriously died in his sleep after just a few weeks in office. Records from this time are spotty at best. Some popes are listed by name, but without any accompanying details. No letters, no decisions, no descriptions of their reigns. Others appear in later documents, but can't be corroborated with earlier sources. It's like flipping through a family photo album and realizing entire relatives have been airbrushed in or out. Take Pope John VI. Go ahead, try to find him. You'll notice something odd: he doesn't exist. The numbering of the popes named John skips from 99 to 21. Why historians now believe that in the confusion of the 11th century, someone accidentally double-counted a Pope John, and the mistake stuck. But if we can miscount popes in official church history, what else might we have gotten wrong? It gets weirder. There's a figure known as Pope Joan, a legendary woman who supposedly disguised herself as a man, rose through the church ranks, and became pope only to be discovered when she gave birth during a procession. Most historians dismiss this as medieval satire, a cautionary tale against female ambition. But the fact that her story persisted for centuries, appearing in chronicles and art, raises questions about whether she was entirely fictional or whether something happened that was later deliberately erased. And then there's the curious case of Benedict IX, a pope who reigned 3 separate times, was accused of simony debauchery, and basically every medieval vice except dragon hoarding. At one point, he literally sold the papacy to his godfather. True story. Which makes you wonder if that level of chaos was admitted into the historical record, what was left out. We also have gaps where papal documents just don't exist. Some bulls are referenced in other texts but can't be found. Some decisions have dates but no signatures. And in a few strange cases, entire years pass without a pope being listed, despite the church insisting there was never a break in succession. Was it bureaucratic incompetence, power struggles, or intentional rewriting? Remember, these were centuries when control of the papacy meant influence over King's War's land and vast amounts of gold. If your family could install a pope or pretend one never happened, you could reshape history without lifting a sword. In fact, some families did try. The Crescenti and Tusculani clans essentially ran the Vatican like a crime syndicate, installing their relatives on the papal throne and rewriting records to suit their political aims. One chronicler even suggested that the Vatican archives during this time were guarded with suspicion, altered at will, and kept as tools of control. All of this leaves modern historians playing a sort of theological detective game. Who was real? Who was rewritten? Who was invented? And what secrets might still be locked inside the vaults of the Vatican Library, whose shelves, by the way, stretch for miles and are mostly closed to the public. So yes, we know the names of 286 popes, but don't assume all of them were real or righteous or even particularly interested in religion. Some may have been political puppets, some may have been myth, and some, if we're being honest, were probably just in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong last name. The truth is, when history is written by the victors, especially the ones with incense and very fancy hats, sometimes the footnotes get buried under marble. Let's set aside our popes and palimpsests for a moment and head north to a world of long ships, stormy coasts, and explorers who definitely didn't ask for directions. The Vikings are usually portrayed as axe-wielding maniacs with a flair for pyrotechnics and monastery looting. But there's another side to them, one quietly scribbled into the margins of history. They were far better navigators than they were ever given credit for. And if certain maps and artifacts are to be believed, they may have reached lands that officially they shouldn't have even known existed. Enter the mystery of the Viking world that wasn't supposed to exist. Most of us were taught that the Norse only made it as far as Greenland, with Leif Erikson making a brief stop in Vinland, probably somewhere in Newfoundland, before the whole expedition was deemed too inconvenient and cold. But archaeologists keep tripping over things, coins, tools, ruins, that suggest Viking presence farther and deeper than the textbooks admit. Take the main penny, for instance. Found in 1957 at a Native American dig site in coastal Maine, this small silver coin turned out to be Norse, dated to the reign of King Olaf III, circa 1065-1080. Now, did a Viking personally drop it while looking for lobster? Maybe not. It could have traded hands a dozen times before arriving. But still, it ended up in Maine, and that raises questions about just how far Norse influence stretched. Then there's the Kensington runestone, discovered in Minnesota in 1898, which claims to tell the story of a Norse expedition into the heart of North America in the 14th century. Mainstream scholars cry hoax, and to be fair, the runestone's language and grammar are suspiciously modern. But even if it's a fake, its existence proves this idea was floating around for centuries, that the Vikings might have ventured far beyond Greenland's icy shores. And what about the Vinland map? Once celebrated as proof of pre-Columbian Norse exploration of North America, it was later debunked as a likely forgery. But here's the twist. The forgery was done using techniques that fooled experts for decades, which means someone went to an awful lot of trouble to insert Vikings into that historical narrative. Why was it just mischief? Or was there a long-lost memory someone was trying to revive? Even more compelling is the Norse settlement at Lance Meadows in Newfoundland, officially recognized by UNESCO as the real deal. It's proof that Vikings didn't just visit, they settled, if only briefly. The artifacts there include iron nails, a soapstone spindle whorl, and signs of butternut. Use a plant that doesn't grow in Newfoundland, suggesting travel farther south. And the Norse weren't just sailing blind. They had sunstones crystals that may have helped them locate the sun's position, even on cloudy days, acting like primitive polarizing filters. Combined with their advanced knowledge of currents, winds, and bird patterns, this allowed them to cross vast distances with unnerving accuracy. For people who supposedly feared sailing too far from land, they sure left a lot of boat paths in strange places. The mystery deepens when we look at Icelandic sagas, which, while filled with trolls and feuds, do mention strange lands west of Greenland with grapes forests and unfriendly locals. These were written centuries after the events, so they're not direct evidence, but they're tantalizing breadcrumbs nonetheless. What's most striking about the Viking exploration mystery isn't just how far they may have gone, it's how thoroughly their story was sidelined. European narratives tend to give Columbus all the glory, conveniently ignoring the red-bearded men who probably beat him to the punch by 500 years. Why, perhaps? Because the Norse weren't spreading Christianity. Perhaps because they didn't stay long enough to plant flags and build cathedrals. Or perhaps because by the time Europe was ready to write down history in earnest, the Viking Age was already being romanticized, simplified, or swept under the rug. But in recent years, that rug's been lifted. A growing body of evidence suggests the Norse weren't just raiders. They were traders, settlers, and map makers. And somewhere between the sagas and the silver coins lies the story of a forgotten world the Vikings may have quietly claimed long before anyone else arrived to take credit. So next time someone says Leif Erikson was just a warm-up act for Columbus, feel free to mention the Maine penny, or the butternuts in Newfoundland, or that suspicious runestone in Minnesota. And then ask if this is what we have found. What else is still buried in the moss? Now that we've sailed with the Vikings, let's shift our gaze back toward Europe's core, specifically to the notion of a Renaissance tucked right in the middle of the so-called Dark Ages. Yes, you heard that right. The Carolingian Renaissance, they called it. A sudden burst of art learning and administrative reform centered around Charlemagne's court in the late 8th and early 9th centuries. Sounds impressive, doesn't it? Maybe even a little suspicious. Because here is the thing, Europe wasn't exactly lighting up the intellectual skies during this period. Most folks couldn't read. Cities were small and frequently on fire. Diseases and Viking raids were seasonal events. And yet, from this backdrop of mud and mayhem, emerged a court of scholars, translating texts, standardizing scripts, and debating philosophy by candlelight. All under the banner of Charlemagne, the man with the shiny new empire and a strong incentive to appear. Timeless. Historians call it a renaissance, but it's more like a well-curated museum exhibit, tidy, selective, and possibly a bit embellished. The Carolingians weren't inventing new sciences or philosophies. They were repackaging the classical past, copying and preserving works from ancient Rome and Greece, and placing them within a Christian framework. Laudable, yes. Spontaneous explosion of genius. Maybe not. Let's look at the mechanics. Charlemagne recruited scholars like Alcuin of York, who helped establish scriptoria monastic writing centers dedicated to copying manuscripts. They used Carolingian minuscule, a standardized form of writing that's suspiciously modern-looking and easy to read, which led to better preservation of texts. Wonderful, right? But also convenient. When your regime wants to create the illusion of order and divine favor, inventing a beautiful, legible script that makes your documents look ancient and important is a pretty good move. There's also the matter of how selective the revival was. Pagan works, preserved, but only the ones that could be safely interpreted through a Christian lens. Medical texts, sometimes kept, sometimes purified. Anything that hinted at pre-Christian spirituality or threatened church dogma. Well, let's just say those books made excellent kindling during long winters, and yet somehow, despite the chaos around them, the Carolingians managed to project an image of intellectual dominance. They wrote about themselves in glowing terms. They preserved genealogies stretching back into legend. They even mapped out the world, not as it was, but as it ought to be, with their empire conveniently at the center. But here's where things get twisty. The administrative reforms, they introduced standardized measurements, clearer legal codes. Royal decrees sound familiar. A bit too familiar. As if someone were trying to retroactively impose modern order onto an otherwise murky period of history. Some scholars have suggested that later chroniclers, especially during the 12th and 13th centuries, polished up Charlemagne's legacy to suit political and theological needs. After all, nothing legitimizes a monarch quite like claiming descent from a divinely ordained, hyper-literate emperor who ruled in accordance with God and geometry. Meanwhile, in the countryside, most peasants probably didn't notice they were living in a renaissance. Their literacy rates were still abysmal. Their crops still failed. Their walls still didn't keep out raiders. So was this really a renaissance, or a renaissance of paperwork confined to a handful of cloisters and palaces? One could argue that the Carolingian Renaissance was less about enlightenment and more about branding, a rebranding of the fragmented post-Roman world into something more manageable, more Christian, and most importantly, more useful for future church leaders and kings looking to justify their power. Even today, much of our understanding of early medieval Europe is shaped by these curated documents and codices. And every time we study them, we have to wonder how much is original thought and how much is calculated myth-making. So the next time someone says the Dark Ages were all plague and pig farming, you can nod sagely and say, well, actually, there was a renaissance, but it may have been more footnote than fireworks. If you were to walk into a medieval classroom, which admittedly would probably smell like ink wool and a touch of panic, you'd expect to hear Latin echoing off the stone walls. And you would. Latin was the language of learning religion and record keeping. But scratch beneath the surface, and you'll find something stranger dead languages that never quite died, and stranger tongues that no one admits to speaking, yet somehow kept turning up in the margins. Let's start with Latin itself. By the 9th century, it had split in two. There was the High Latin, the stuff of mass, and manuscripts, all clean grammar and classical airs. And then there was Low Latin, a Frankenstein's monster of local dialects, spoken with such regional weirdness that it was nearly incomprehensible from one village to the next. This messy, mutating version of Latin would eventually become French, Spanish, Italian, and so on. But during the Dark Ages, it was like the Tower of Babel had pitched a tent and decided to stick around. But Latin wasn't the only linguistic ghost roaming the ruins of the Roman world. In monasteries, especially in remote areas like Ireland, Greek Hebrew, and even scraps of Coptic, show up in texts, languages that supposedly fell out of use centuries earlier. Yet monks were still copying and sometimes even scribbling side notes in. Why? Who was still teaching these languages? And more curiously, who was reading them? Take Ogham, the mysterious script carved into stones across Ireland and parts of the British Isles. It looks like tally marks scratched by a bored shepherd, but it's actually a complex alphabet used to record names, boundaries, and possibly even rituals. Though it officially fell out of use in the 7th century, new stones kept popping up for centuries afterward, suggesting someone was still using it privately, quietly, perhaps even secretly. Then there's runic script used by Germanic peoples across Northern Europe. Even after Christianization and the rise of Latin literacy, runes kept being carved into swords, churches, and gravestones. In some cases, they appear side by side with Latin, like two languages performing an awkward duet. And many of these runes don't translate cleanly. They use abbreviations, symbols, and poetic riddles that baffle modern scholars. Were they magical, mnemonic messages meant only for the initiated? One tantalizing theory is that these lingering scripts weren't just quaint holdovers, but subversive tools. If the dominant powers wrote in Latin, then a runestone carved in a farmer's dialect was a quiet act of resistance. A spell, a protest, or maybe just a diary entry that said, I was here and I had thoughts too. Even stranger is the appearance of so-called glosses, translations, or notes scribbled into the margins of holy texts. Some of these are in known languages, others in half-lost tongues that seem to exist only in that one copy. We are talking entire systems of grammar and vocabulary preserved in 10 words on the edge of a page. And the kicker: sometimes these notes translate incorrectly, deliberately, twisting the original meaning, as if the scribe was silently arguing with the authority of the text. It's also during this time that invented languages start to pop up, constructed for religious, magical, or mnemonic purposes. Think of Enochian, the angelic language that would surface centuries later in Renaissance magic. Its roots, though murky, may trace back to earlier experiments in symbolic writing during the Middle Ages, where monks or mystics tried to devise languages pure enough for divine communication. There's even a strange phenomenon where identical phrases, unusual word pairings, metaphors, or idioms show up in manuscripts from different regions written decades apart in languages that supposedly weren't connected. Were these just coincidences or remnants of an oral tradition older and wider than we've accounted for? The overarching theme here is that language in the Dark Ages wasn't just a tool, it was a boundary line. To read Latin was to join the elite. To write in runes was to stay grounded in the old ways. To carve ogham into a stone was to claim land memory or power in a world that was increasingly trying to erase alternative voices. And as we sift through these layers of overlapping tongues, half-erased alphabets, and scribbled rebellions, we begin to see the Dark Ages not as a silence, but as a whispering chorus, speaking in a dozen dialects, at once daring us to listen. Let's turn eastward now to the mighty marble-walled empire that somehow never gets invited to the Western European dinner party, Byzantium. Also known as the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium outlived its Western cousin by nearly 1,000 years, spoke mostly Greek, maintained Roman law, and developed some of the world's most stunning mosaics architecture and theological debates involving more beards than a lumberjack convention. And yet, for some reason, Western histories tend to forget it existed. This isn't just a gap in school textbooks. It's a full-on civilizational blind spot. For many centuries, Byzantine history was treated like a strange sideshow. Even its name, Byzantine, is a modern invention. The people who lived there just called themselves Romans. They saw their emperor as the rightful heir to Caesar, their city of Constantinople as the new Rome, and their job as preserving civilization, while the rest of Europe spent a few centuries play fighting over cows and theology. So why don't we hear more about them? Part of the problem is geography and language. After the Western Empire fell in 476 AD, Latin faded in the East, replaced by Greek. Western Europe, still trying to glue itself back together with Latin prayers and Frankish swords, began to see Constantinople as foreign alien, even suspiciously clever. And no one likes the cousin who has indoor plumbing and doesn't get invaded every Tuesday. Byzantium also didn't play nice with the Roman Catholic Church. The theological split between East and West, culminating in the Great Schism of 1054, led to centuries of mutual excommunication, name-calling, and the religious version of blocking each other on every platform. As a result, Western chroniclers downplayed or outright ignored the Byzantine contribution to law, science, and art, which is absurd, because these people were busy doing everything we associate with the so-called Renaissance. Centuries early, they preserved ancient Greek texts long before Italian humanists started fawning over Aristotle. They had medical manuals, public hospitals, and some of the first recorded quarantine protocols. Their engineers built siphons, fire throwers, and the terrifying Greek fire, a napalm-like substance that could burn on water, and whose recipe remains a state secret to this day, or just completely lost, depending on how optimistic you are. Even their cities were ahead of the curve. Constantinople had aqueducts, cisterns, sewer systems, and a public welfare system that handed out bread to the poor. Meanwhile, London was still arguing over whose turn it was to dump the chamber pot. But as Byzantium rose in sophistication, it also withdrew behind its walls, both literally and figuratively. The empire's survival strategy was one of bureaucracy, diplomacy, and occasional ruthless betrayal. Western powers, especially the Franks and the later Crusaders, found this unsettling. Where were the bold conquests, the theatrical martyrdoms, the brave but doomed cavalry charges? Instead, Byzantines wrote treaties, negotiated dowries, and employed eunuch generals who actually knew how to run a battlefield. Unsurprisingly, Western knights didn't quite understand or appreciate the subtlety. And history, as we know, is often written by people with louder swords. Things hit a disastrous peak in 1204 when Western Crusaders, originally headed for Jerusalem, decided to sack Constantinople instead. They looted the city, desecrated churches, and carted off everything from holy relics to gold-plated doorknobs. After that, Byzantium never fully recovered, limping along until 1453, when the Ottomans finally took the city. And yet even then, the knowledge, culture, and political ideas of Byzantium didn't vanish. They trickled westward, carried by scholars fleeing the fall of Constantinople, bringing with them manuscripts, philosophies, and a refined sense of how to run an empire without turning everything into mud. So why does Byzantium still feel like a historical afterthought? Perhaps because it defies the simple story arc. It wasn't a tragic fall like Rome, nor a triumphant rise like Renaissance Italy. It was complicated, contradictory, maddeningly efficient, and weirdly modern in ways that made its medieval neighbors uncomfortable. But if the Dark Ages are shadowed by mystery, Byzantium is the lantern flickering just out of reach, holding on to the knowledge that others abandoned, choosing bureaucracy over bravado and diplomacy over drama. And maybe that's why it got quietly left out of the Western narrative. It survived too long. It adapted too well. It refused to be romantic. And in a world obsessed with collapse and rebirth, there's nothing more mysterious than an empire that simply endured. While much of Europe during the so-called Dark Ages was struggling to rebuild after Rome's collapse, there was one unlikely hotspot where the lights not only stayed on, they glowed with a quiet brilliance: medieval Spain. And the most surprising thing about it, it was for a time one of the only places in the world where Muslims, Jews, and Christians studied together under the same roof. Not always peacefully, not always equally, but together. And that made all the difference. Welcome to Al-Andalus, the Muslim-ruled region of the Iberian Peninsula, particularly centered around Cordoba. While muddy villages and raiding parties defined much of northern Europe, Cordoba, in the 10th century, had streetlights, public libraries, baths, and a population that rivaled or surpassed Constantinople or Baghdad. Think domes, fountains, jasmine gardens, and scholars elbow-deep in parchment by candlelight. This was where the secret schools of Spain quietly blossomed. In Cordoba and later in Toledo, Muslim caliphs funded translation movements, massive scholarly projects to translate ancient Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic. This included works by Aristotle, Galen and Ptolemy. Euclid, think of it as the intellectual Amazon Prime of the ancient world. Then centuries later, Christian scholars translated those Arabic texts into Latin, creating a chain of knowledge that stretched across centuries and civilizations. But here's the secret sauce in some corners of Al-Andalus. Christian monks, Jewish rabbis, and Muslim philosophers worked side by side. They debated science, medicine, astronomy, and ethics, not always with perfect harmony, of course, but with enough respect to keep the ink flowing and the arguments civil. This quiet collaboration had monumental effects. Europe's later rediscovery of classical knowledge didn't happen by accident. It happened because Spanish scholars had already been curating and protecting that wisdom for centuries. And much of what was later attributed to new breakthroughs in science and medicine were in fact translations of translations passed through Arabic hands with margin notes and occasional theological warnings attached. The most famous translator of this age was Gerard of Cremona, who traveled to Toledo in the 12th century and allegedly translated over 70 major works from Arabic to Latin. One man, 70 books. That's not just productivity, that's obsession. But what matters is what he translated Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, Ptolemy's Almagest, and texts on physics, surgery, and optics that would go on to shape European universities for centuries. And yet much of this knowledge remained tucked away, sometimes literally in monastery basements or in private libraries guarded by families who feared persecution. The rise of Christian dominance in Spain after the Reconquista didn't always embrace the cultural synthesis of Al-Andalus. In fact, it often erased it, rewriting the narrative to highlight pious warriors and righteous kings while glossing over the complex multicultural academic networks that had fed Europe's intellectual awakening. What makes this especially fascinating is that much of what we now think of as Western science has roots in this tri-faith alliance forged under foreign rule in a land where the architecture echoed with Quranic verses and philosophical debate. Algebra, chemistry, medical diagnostics, and even the concept of the scientific method, these all owe debts to scholars of medieval Spain, many of whom never made it into European history books. It wasn't always peaceful, of course. There were tensions, expulsions, and power shifts. But for a time, knowledge transcended ideology. Arabic texts included Hebrew notes. Latin translations preserved Muslim commentaries. And somehow, in an age more often defined by borders and wars, a handful of thinkers created a cross-cultural academic underground that would one day burst into full bloom during the Renaissance. So yes, while knights clanged swords in the north and popes debated over doctrinal minutiae in Rome, there were men and women in southern Spain looking up at the stars, copying diagrams of the human body, and arguing over Aristotle's logic, all while sipping mint tea beneath palm fronds. And they left us more than just manuscripts. They left us a blueprint for coexistence, a reminder that even in so-called dark times, the pursuit of knowledge can build bridges stronger than stone and keep a flickering flame alive until the rest of the world is ready to see it. Now let's dig quite literally into the soil of history, because while texts can be burned, banned, or rewritten, bones rarely lie. And what they're telling us about the so-called Dark Ages is enough to make several textbooks squirm. Archaeology, that gentle art of poking the ground until it confesses, has been quietly rewriting our understanding of early medieval life. And the story it tells is a bit more complex than the traditional mud-caked peasant cliché. Let's begin with the skeletons themselves. For decades, the assumption was simple after the fall of Rome. European life became nasty, brutish, and short. But recent bioarchaeological studies suggest that in some areas, post-Roman populations were healthier and better nourished than their urbanized Roman predecessors. Why possibly fewer taxes? Possibly more protein? Possibly just less lead in their plumbing? Whatever the reason, people in some post-imperial rural communities seem to have grown taller and lived longer than expected than their surgery. Yes, surgery. Archaeologists have uncovered skulls from the early Middle Ages with trepanation holes. That's a fancy way of saying someone drilled into the skull, where the patient not only survived, but healed. Let that sink in. While monks were chanting Latin in one corner of Europe, someone else was opening up heads with medieval tools. And not just killing people. That alone deserves a standing ovation from the Department of Surprising Historical Competence. And it's not just skulls. Excavations of old cemeteries have revealed amputations with clean bone cuts and signs of healing, meaning some communities had both the surgical skill and the post-op care to keep people alive. That challenges the notion that anything more complex than bloodletting was out of reach before the Renaissance. Meanwhile, dental evidence has been telling its own story. Teeth from early medieval burials show varied diets, often richer in meat and less sugar-heavy than later medieval populations who got hooked on imported goods. Enamel analysis even shows signs of seasonal fasting or feasting cycles, suggesting communities were deeply attuned to agricultural rhythms, religious calendars, or both. And what about migration? You might think people stayed put. What with the wolves' wars and generally terrible road conditions? But isotope testing, looking at the chemical signature in bones, shows that people moved around far more than we thought. Women from Scandinavia buried in England. Men from North Africa found in French monastic cemeteries. A 7th century grave in Bavaria with a skeleton born in the Mediterranean. It turns out the Dark Ages were surprisingly well traveled. Let's not forget grave goods, the objects buried alongside the deceased. We used to think these vanished after Christianity spread. But that's not quite true. In many regions, people kept slipping jewelry tools and even weapons into graves long after official doctrine banned it, suggesting either that the church didn't have as much control as it claimed, or that old beliefs died harder than expected. Even the humble clay pot is speaking up. Pottery styles that were once thought to be purely local are turning out to be surprisingly mobile, with similar patterns showing up across hundreds of miles. That implies trade, or at least shared cultural templates stretching across supposedly isolated communities. And then we have the burials themselves. In recent decades, archaeologists have found graves with multiple individuals, not from mass death events like plagues, but possibly from family plots or communal rites. Others are buried in curious positions, on their sides, face down or curled up, raising questions about ritual punishment, or maybe just eccentric undertakers. Some graves are even aligned, not east-west, the typical Christian orientation, but north-south, a configuration that sometimes signals pagan influence, or that someone somewhere decided to politely ignore the church's instructions. All of this paints a portrait of early medieval Europe, not as a wasteland of ignorance, but as a patchwork of adaptation. People were surviving, improvising, mixing old beliefs with new ones, and sometimes performing brain surgery, while the history books were too busy labeling them as backward. So the next time you hear someone say that nothing happened between Rome and the Renaissance, you might gently remind them that somewhere in 9th century Bavaria, a man with a hole in his head lived to tell the tale and was probably chewing tougher bread than we'd care to try. Let's look up now, way up. Because while the medieval world is often cast as entirely earthbound, preoccupied with mud plagues, and which saint to pray to for sheep fertility, there was another force quietly at play in the towers of monasteries and the domes of churches' astronomy. And not just look at the pretty stars astronomy, but charts, calculations, and strange machines built by people we barely remember, tracking skies with remarkable precision. Which raises the question, what exactly were medieval monks hoping to find up there? First, let's set the scene. You're a monk. It's the year 842, and your abbey sits on a lonely hill with a great view of the night sky. There's no light pollution, no radio chatter, just stars everywhere. And because it's your job to mark time for prayers, Easter, and planting, you start noticing patterns. The moon doesn't just glow, it moves. The sun shifts. Sometimes things blink or streak, and once in a while, something appears where it shouldn't, an unwelcome guest in heaven's clockwork. Thus began the monastic obsession with celestial order. Medieval monks became some of the earliest and most dedicated astronomers in Europe. They charted equinoxes, solstices, eclipses, and phases of the moon, not just for curiosity, but because everything in their world depended on timing, harvests, liturgical calendars, even political decisions. A mistimed Easter could cause an entire kingdom to fast when it should be feasting. And trust me, nothing ruins morale like Lent in the middle of lamb season. But it goes deeper. Some monastic libraries contain elaborate star charts with constellations mapped out in fine ink on parchment. Some even included planetary diagrams showing the movements of Mars, Jupiter, and Venus across the firmament. And though geocentrism, Earth at the center, was the accepted view, not all were satisfied with it. Certain diagrams, like the enigmatic Toledo tables, hint at astronomers pushing boundaries, tweaking models, and looking over their shoulders while doing it. Then there's the machinery. Yes, machinery. Ever heard of an orrery? It's a model of the solar system. The ancient Greeks had them. So did the Islamic world. But tucked away in a few medieval corners, we find clockwork-like devices that mimicked lunar cycles and planetary motion. Some were used for predicting tides, others for mapping eclipses. A few might have just been glorified calendars, but they still required serious mathematical knowledge to construct. And this wasn't just a Christian pastime. In places like Al-Andalus, Jewish and Muslim astronomers worked with geometry and trigonometry to perfect astrolabes devices used for navigation, prayer timing, and charting the heavens. These tools often made their way north into monasteries, sometimes without credit, sometimes with great reverence. Why all this effort? Why such precision? Some say it was purely religious devotion to better know the mind of God through the patterns of His creation. Others argue it was practical, tied to agriculture and navigation. But there's a third possibility whispered in the margins: fear and wonder. You see, the medieval sky was also a canvas for omens. A comet was not just a rock with a tail, it was a warning, an eclipse, divine judgment, a new star, possibly the birth or death of a king. Chronicles from the 9th to 12th centuries are full of entries like a terrible red star appeared in the east, followed by, say, a royal assassination or inexplicable famine. Astronomers weren't just observers, they were interpreters, decoding messages that came without parchment or seal. In an age where news traveled by mule and memory, the stars were the one universal broadcast available to all but readable by few, and sometimes the readings got strange. One monk in 11th century France described a wheel of fire in the sky, while an Anglo-Saxon chronicle mentioned celestial dragons. Were they meteors? Auroras, hallucinations, brought on by fasting and insomnia? Perhaps, but they were recorded seriously carefully as part of the celestial ledger. There's even evidence, controversial but intriguing, that some monastic communities tracked long-term cycles like the Saros cycle of eclipses or the 76-year cycle of Halley's Comet. That implies not just observation, but generational record keeping, passing down data from monk to monk like a sacred flame. So the next time someone tells you medieval Europe was just dirt and superstition, remind them that while peasants plowed and kings plotted, there were hooded figures standing under vaulted ceilings, peering through slits in stone towers, meticulously tracking the dance of the cosmos. Because sometimes the only way to survive the darkness is to study the stars. By now, we've sifted through bones, scrolls, and constellations. But what about the one force that reshapes civilizations without lifting a sword? Climate. That's right. Forget armies and emperors. Sometimes the real plot twist is a few degrees of temperature. And during the so-called Dark Ages, the weather took a dramatic turn. A cold one. One so impactful it sent empires reeling, crops failing, and entire populations migrating. Welcome to the unsettling mystery of the Great Climate Disruption. Sometime between the 6th and 7th centuries, something strange happened. Tree rings got thinner. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica show spikes in volcanic ash. Historical records, at least the ones that weren't eaten by mice, start describing dim suns, failed harvests, and bizarre-colored skies. It was in modern terms a global climate event. But back then, it just looked like the gods had stopped answering their mail. Scientists now believe this period, often dubbed the Late Antique Little Ice Age, was kicked off by a series of massive volcanic eruptions, possibly in the tropics. The result: ash and aerosols in the upper atmosphere, blocking sunlight, lowering global temperatures, and essentially wrecking agriculture for years at a time. How bad was it? Some scholars call it the worst climate event in the last 500 years. Starting around 536 AD, there are records from all over China, Byzantium, the Middle East, describing a sun that gave no light and years with no summer. Famine spread, epidemics followed. And just to make things extra apocalyptic, the plague of Justinian showed up right around then, a bubonic nightmare that may have killed over a third of the Mediterranean population. So yes, it was a rough century. And yet this event barely registers in popular history. Why possibly? Because it doesn't fit the narrative. Climate isn't as charismatic as emperors. You can't put a blizzard on a throne or blame a drought for plotting treason. But for the people who lived through it, this cooling wasn't abstract. It was devastating. Whole societies were forced to adapt. In Scandinavia, marginal farmlands were abandoned. In Ireland, annals record cattle deaths so massive that entire clans collapsed. Even in Central Asia, migrations surged, possibly laying the groundwork for the future conquests of the Avars, the Turks, and eventually the Mongols. The dominoes didn't just fall in Europe, they shook the whole northern hemisphere. And here's the strange part. In some places, cooling had unexpected benefits. For example, in the Arabian Peninsula, slightly milder temperatures and increased rainfall in the 7th century may have supported agriculture and camel herding indirectly, contributing to the rapid expansion of early Islam. One region's disaster can be another's opportunity, especially when the climate rolls the dice. But perhaps the most fascinating part of this mystery is how little the people of the time understood it, and yet how much they tried to explain it. Some blamed it on sin, others on sorcery. In some Slavic regions, myths emerged about gods retreating from the world in anger. In the Alps, entire valleys held torchlight processions to wake up the sun. It's easy to laugh, but what else could they do when the sky stops behaving and your last 3 barley harvests, turned to sludge theology, starts to look like meteorology? Fast forward a few centuries, and the climate roller coaster didn't stop. The medieval warm period followed around the 9th to 13th centuries, bringing milder winters, better crops, and not coincidentally, population booms. Cathedrals went up, trade routes reopened, cities grew. And then, right on schedule, came the Little Ice Age of the 14th century Q famine plague and peasant revolts. History's not a straight line. It's more like a weather report full of sunny delusions, followed by surprise hailstorms. And the people of the early medieval world? They were stuck in the forecast without a raincoat. But here's the twist. We're only just beginning to piece this story together. Thanks to ice cores, sediment layers, and tree rings, modern climate science is helping us see the ghosts of weather past, and their fingerprints are all over the so-called Dark Ages. So next time you wonder why a city fell, a king lost power, or a civilization moved mountains to nowhere, consider checking the temperature, because in the long run, climate doesn't ask permission. It changes the game, and everyone, no matter how royal or holy, has to play along. Now, if you're the sort of person who enjoys falling asleep with a mild existential crisis, this next one's for you. Because some historians, fringe ones, but loud, nonetheless, have suggested that entire centuries of history may not have happened at all. That's right. Not we don't have enough records, or there are inconsistencies. No, they're saying someone somewhere might have made up a few hundred years and just added them into the timeline. This is the phantom time hypothesis, and it's exactly as wild as it sounds. The theory was proposed in the 1990s by German historian Heribert Illig, who argued that the years between 614 and 911 AD were largely fabricated. In his view, some combination of medieval rulers and clerics, possibly including the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II, collaborated to backdate documents and forge an imperial lineage that made their current reigns seem more legitimate. Why would they do this? Because Otto III allegedly wanted to rule in the year 1000, an impressive holy-sounding round number. But unfortunately for him, he was born a bit too early. Solution: add a few centuries to the record, and voila, Welcome to the first millennium. It sounds like science fiction, or maybe an elaborate Renaissance-era prank, but Illig took it seriously. He pointed to things like a lack of archaeological evidence for certain events, discrepancies between calendar systems and astronomical data like eclipses, the suspiciously clean legend of Charlemagne, who according to Illig might have been more myth than man, a Frankenstein composite of earlier and later rulers. Now, before you throw your entire historical education into the fire, you should know that mainstream historians reject this theory completely. With good reason. We do, in fact, have coins, buildings, manuscripts, and even tree ring data that correspond to those phantom centuries. The idea that 300 years were fabricated and no one noticed is a bit like claiming someone added fake chapters to Harry Potter and every bookstore just went along with it. And yet, the appeal lingers, partly because history is messy. Dates are often wrong, rulers are misattributed, wars are poorly documented. In some medieval chronologies, kings ruled for absurdly long stretches. One poor guy was said to have reigned for 80 years without anyone noticing he'd apparently become immortal. Add to that the fact that much of early medieval dating was based on church records and chronicles written decades or even centuries after the fact, and you can start to understand how the timeline might wobble. For example, during the early Middle Ages, Anno Domini AD dating was still gaining traction. Not everyone used the same system. Some folks dated events from the founding of Rome, others from the reign of this or that king. A few particularly bold monks just guessed. It wasn't until later centuries later that timelines were standardized, often retroactively, sometimes creatively. And remember those papal gaps from earlier, the mysterious years with missing or duplicate popes, the forged charters, the inconsistent royal genealogies. These don't prove Illig's theory, but they do show that historical record keeping was more duct tape than precision gear. Still, most historians agree that, while errors and embellishments certainly occurred, the broad structure of our timeline is solid. Charlemagne was real, probably. The year 800 happened, we think, and although medieval scribes had many talents orchestrating a continent-wide conspiracy to invent centuries, is a bit much even for them. But what's fascinating isn't whether Illig was right. It's why people are drawn to the idea. Maybe it's because we instinctively mistrust authority. Maybe it's because modern life makes us feel disconnected from the past, and blaming that on fake centuries is oddly satisfying. Or maybe it's just because the Dark Ages are so poorly documented that our imaginations can't resist filling in the blanks with dragons, emperors, or time forgeries. In the end, the phantom time hypothesis is a historical ghost story. Not because it's true, but because it taps into a deeper fear that the world isn't as well ordered as we've been told. That time is fragile. That maybe, just maybe, we've been dreaming through a few centuries that were never really there. So here we are standing at the edge of the unknown, having marched through 12 centuries of dimly lit corridors, dusty manuscripts, rogue popes, mysterious bones, and stars tracked by candlelight. And now it's time to ask the one question that both delights and frustrates every historian. Night owl and bedtime skeptic alike. What do we actually know, and what still hides just out of reach? Let's be honest, despite all the scrolls and skulls, what we have from the Dark Ages and ancient times is still a fraction of what once existed. For every manuscript preserved, a dozen may have been lost to fire mold, conquest, or careless goats. For every skeleton carefully unearthed and studied, hundreds remain buried beneath fields, churches, or parking lots. Even now, new discoveries are overturning old assumptions at a dizzying pace. In the past few decades alone, we've found ancient bacteria preserved in teeth that tell us how people really died. DNA evidence that rewrote migration histories, long lost texts recovered through multispectral imaging texts that were once erased and overwritten by monks who either didn't know what they were destroying or didn't care. Coins, tools, and jewelry in places no one thought they should be, hinting at trade networks and contact zones far beyond the borders of textbook maps. And it's not just the physical stuff. Ideas, too, survive in odd ways. A medieval monk scribbling a joke in the margin of a Bible. A woman weaving Norse myth into a Christian tapestry. A scholar quietly sneaking Greek philosophy into a Latin sermon. These are the whispers that tell us there was more going on than we've been told. But despite everything we've uncovered, so many secrets remain unexplained. The recipe for Greek fire, the identity of certain shadowy rulers, the full contents of the great library of Alexandria before it burned, the exact routes of forgotten migrations, the lost voices of ordinary people whose names were never written down. Some mysteries are probably gone forever. Others are just waiting in the ground, the attic of a monastery, or the back room of a dusty museum where a mislabeled box hasn't been opened since the 1890s. And a few are hiding in plain sight, misinterpreted, mistranslated, or simply ignored because they don't fit the current narrative. So what do we really know? We know the Dark Ages weren't pitch black. They were cloudy, uneven, and full of contradictions. We know ancient history wasn't a smooth march from primitive to enlightened. It was cyclical, messy, interrupted, and sometimes wildly weird. And we know that for every answer we dig up, history hands us 10 more questions wrapped in parchment and tied with a riddle. But maybe that's the point. Because history isn't about having all the answers. It's about the pursuit, the curiosity, the wonder. It's about seeing a pattern on an old map and thinking, wait, that shouldn't be there. It's about noticing a saint with a snake in his lap and wondering what the scribe was really trying to say. It's about realizing that the past isn't just behind us. It's still breathing under our feet, etched in the stones, painted on forgotten walls, whispered in ancient dialects. And in that way, the greatest mystery of all might not be the lost centuries, the phantom kings, or the suspiciously advanced concrete. It might be this, why we're still so drawn to the shadows, still compelled to shine a light into the dimmest corners of our history, hoping to glimpse some lost truths. Or maybe just to know that someone long ago was wondering about us too. So now, with the mysteries laid out like old manuscripts across a quiet table, we let the stories drift away. The ancient fires are embers, now their glow soft and fading. The Viking ships have returned to fog. The monks have lowered their quills. The forgotten kings and forged centuries melt gently into the blur between dream and history. Take a breath. Let the timelines unravel a little. It's okay if not everything fits. It's okay if some answers never come. That's the quiet magic of history. It invites us not just to know, but to imagine, to wonder, to remember that behind every silence in the record, there was someone living, breathing, reaching for meaning in their own strange moment. Let the sound of ink on parchment echo softly in your mind, the steady ticking of an ancient astronomical clock, the hush of snow over a ruined Roman road, the heartbeat of a world that never truly slept, even when its stories were hidden beneath centuries of dust. And as you close your eyes tonight, know this: the past may be distant, but it's never gone. It's part of us in our languages, our cities, even our dreams. We carry it forward, piece by imperfect piece. Sleep well, fellow traveler. The mysteries will wait.